Okay, so this is a presentation that just basically John Peters and I whipped up, and we're still at the beginning stages of this research. We got some StatsCan data looking at low-wage work and different forms of earnings insecurity over time. And we're trying to we're looking into updating the database that we have on so that we can have the series go up all the way to around 2018, 2019, as it only goes up to 2015 currently. And so, yes, so I look forward to hearing everybody's feedback on this at the end, because we're really at the beginning of the research phase with respect to this. All right, so low-wage work and why it's important. Low-wage work is important because job quality and economic security are critical to enormous social and economic issues. Poverty and inequality relate to low-wage work. Economic development is important to low-wage work because it's the poor earnings have negative effects on economies. Earnings are related to stimulating the economy, and they also relate to individual and social well-being, in that if you have poor earnings and they're insecure, it can make you very stressed. It can lead to anxiety. It can lead to poor organizational outcomes as well, and there are a whole host of issues associated with it. And since the 1980s, there's been a stagnation in real incomes and wage levels, as well as a rising incidence of low pay globally in many OECD countries. So it's important to actually examine this, and there's actually little work that looks at this specifically within the Canadian context. So what will I cover in this presentation? First, I will talk about low-wage work in Canada from an international standpoint. Then I will look at the features and drivers of low-wage work in Canada. So what are some different ways to look at low-wage work in Canada? What are characteristics of it? How does it affect different types of workers? And what do we believe or suspect to believe at this point? Then I will conclude with a summary of and future kind of some comments on what would be interesting future research relating to this topic. So first, low-wage work in Canada and international comparison. Interestingly, Canada, OECD data ranks Canada as the third highest in low pay amongst OECD countries. If you look here, Canada is actually performing worse in terms of having a high number of low-wage workers compared to compared to Ireland, and compared to United Kingdom, Germany, Finland, Belgium, and so on. The only countries that actually fare worse than us are Ireland and the United States. The incidence of low pay that I'm referring to here refers to the share of workers earning less than 2/3 of median earnings. That's the OECD data that we have on that, and it shows Canada not doing very well. And there's also what we've noticed from this quick glance at the data, that there's a major contrast between liberal market economies, such as Canada, Ireland, and the United States, that fare quite poorly, these being markets that have decentralized bargaining, markets that have less regulation in terms of job security, and these places have weaker unions, and countries that have less patient capital. And we notice a contrast between these countries and social democratic countries from such as Finland, Belgium, and Germany. Finland, Belgium, and Sweden. So there's a big distinction between these two. This is probably not surprising, but nonetheless, it's worth covering for context. Interestingly, one thing we notice when we're looking at OECD data is there's measuring low-wage work in the same way. We do see a pretty interesting correlation between low-wage work and bargaining coverage. If you notice, low-wage work tends to be highest in countries such as Canada, the United States, and the UK, where bargaining coverage is quite low, and low-wage work, incidence of low-wage work is lowest in countries such as Finland, Belgium, and Sweden, where bargaining coverage is quite high. And so there seems to be something to do with the industrialization system, and since Canada is among the most decentralized, industrial relation systems in OECD countries, there seems to be a link there, as sectoral bargaining is far more common, for example, in most European countries. We also noticed that globally that there is a link between low pay and public social expenditures. So Canadian public social expenditures, surprisingly, are among the lowest in OECD countries, even more so than the United States. If you look at the data, current expenditure levels in Canada are below 1990 levels, so it's actually gone down over time, and this represents a decline in cuts in federal spending, which, as well as links between federal transfers to provinces, but especially those in employment insurance and social assistance, which have gone down over time. And the link here is that if you have low public social expenditures, there are two effects for workers. One is the fact that workers are more inclined to take jobs with poor working conditions, such as low-pay jobs, because they have fewer alternatives to maintain a decent quality of life otherwise, since they don't have access to decent social assistance and so on and so forth. And the second thing is political, the fact that when citizens are more insecure and they're worried about their next paycheck and they're having to work all these extra hours just to make a living, they're less involved in political life, which is crucial to resisting negative change as well. So that's the international comparison. We do have some interesting charts that we made on looking at the features and drivers of low-wage work in Canada. One of these is insecure employment. So here we actually found some data also that looked at earnings rather than the wage, annual earnings of workers over the time period. And we measured those whose annual earnings were 2/3 of a full-time, full-year worker. And we noticed that over time, there's actually been a growth. Now, we couldn't calculate necessarily the workforce for all of this, but there's been a growth in the actual number of full-time workers and non-standard workers who actually earn 2/3 of the annual earnings of a full-time, full-year worker. And you see here, which this is probably not surprising, but you see that the non-standard workers clearly are more likely to, because they have precarious work contracts, they work less hours, there are far more of them that are having poor earnings. As of 2015 in Canada, 8.6 million workers, or 18,000 Canadian annually. So this is a sizable proportion of the workers that is not earning, that is not making, that is low, has low earnings, earning security, has high level of earning security. And this is interesting. And people that just look at the wages, because when you look at annual earnings, your contract come and go through your hours may change throughout the year. So this actually gives us a broader understanding of the state of worker insecurity in Canada by having this measure as opposed to just the hourly wage. So if you look at this, low wage pay and non-standard employment in Canada, you see that 14% of full-time full-year workers are in low pay as of 2015. That was 45% in non-standard work over time too. So you see that there's clear connection between non-standard work being a contributor of earnings insecurity in Canada, and the fact that non-standard work is very prevalent in Canadian work life is clearly a problem. Here we also at the ratios for non-standard employees to full-time full-year workers across countries, and we see that the actual Canada's ratio is lower than the OECD average. So Canadian workers actually have greater levels of earning security, annual earning security, compared to the OECD average and key comparator countries such as Germany, Ireland, Spain, Austria, and so on and so forth. And this one over here, oops, I think I went too. This is the question of dualization in the labor market as well, which relates to some of the things we were talking about. The fact that 42% of the Canadian labor force is in non-standard employment. It's part-time, temporary, and own account self-employed, meaning that based on what they said to be. So it's just to show you here that 42% of these workers are non-standard workers in Canada, which just gives you a sense of the chunk, right? We show that they're more likely to have higher levels of earning insecurity, but you know, they're a huge chunk, almost half of the economy, half of the workforce in the Canadian economy. We also have looked at some data on post-industrialism, which just shows you how that private services and insecure employment are clearly tied together. This is not surprising, but it's interesting to look at in the Canadian context because there's a need to understand what's happening in Canada. And you see here how the low hourly wage, if you looked at just the low hourly wage, you would underestimate the amounts of earnings insecurity within the various industries. But if you start looking at earnings insecurity, annual earnings security, you see it's far higher. So information, culture, recreation, only 30% are said to be have a low hourly wage, but almost 90% have earnings insecurity, have insecure annual earnings. That's a huge contrast. So it shows you how if you look at both definitions, it gives you a very different picture of how insecure low-wage workers are in Canada. The same with wholesale retail, right? If you're looking at just under 50% for the low hourly wage, but you're looking at over 60% for annual earnings security. And there's a huge contrast, and you look at the contrast in the other private service industries that you see also in that chart there. So financialization, this is just to say that we looked at financialization as a potential contributor as well, and we find no direct connection. This is looking at it one point of time, so we will look, we have yet to do this, but we will look at financialization over a period of time. So this is cash applied to dividends, just looking at industries to the extent that they actually apply dividends. They cash in dividends to get in any given year, but we don't find any relationship, but it's just to say we did it and we're going to look at it some more. And then, so I'll try to make things short, go straight to the summary to move it, but I can. So Canada's incidence of low wage, what do we know about Canada's incidence of low wage work and low wage employment? We know it's among the highest of advanced industrial economies. So far, we seem to think that it has to do with a lack of bargaining coverage, collective bargaining coverage, weak employment standards and enforcement, underfunded social expenditures, post-industrialism and aggressive private sector service employers, and the continuing expansion of non-standard employment. You're saying, hey, you didn't talk about all of that in great detail here. Yeah, because I only had 12 minutes, and I wanted to have something that was presentable, so I didn't hit it in the detail. But these are kind of the things we're going to talk about the paper that we're going to write for it. But we do notice that we require more research on this. We want to look at earnings quality in OECD and how insecure employment compares to low-wage work, because there's not enough discussion of, remember I talked about annual insecurity of earnings, annual earnings insecurity as opposed to low-wage work. So we're trying to push the debate in that direction. We want to explore the question of financialization, as I said, a little bit more. And workers are not captured in the statistics. There are some workers that are not captured in statistics, but for example, temporary migrant workers have increased in Canada, but the picture of their earnings there are some reasons we have some data on this, and there's some reasons why it's a little sketchy to know, how they even fit into the picture. A lot of them are not covered in traditional statistics. Workers in the informal economy, you're thinking, for example, gig work, not covered in statistics in an effective way either. So we're going to have to come up with some ways to explore them in the paper as well. And that's all I have to say about the presentation. Thank you.